Welcome back to Spotlight. Quite an interesting program this evening, and we are going to open the phones in a little while for those persons who want to call and ask Dr. Powers some questions about autism. But we've just been joined by Dr. Sally Powers, and of course she's here with Miss Susan Osborne from the Kingwood Trust in UK, charity in the UK, to set up a program to help to deal with some of the challenges of autism, identify, assess, and mitigate some of the challenges with persons diagnosed with autism, some autistic persons. Welcome to Spotlight. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Good evening.
And I forgot to welcome Ms. Osborne to the BVI. So welcome Ms. Osborne to the BVI, and welcome to the BVI as well.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, of course, everybody wants to know, what is autism?
Okay, well, I think Sue's given a very brief introduction to it, as have these ladies. Essentially, it's a developmental disorder. So it's not an illness that goes away with treatment. It's not a mental health condition that can get worse at times, get better at times. It's what the current thinking is, it's something that happens quite early on in the brains of children. It's a neurological problem, and development goes on a different course, just a slightly different course than it might for a kind of normally developing child, and that can have a lot of consequences to a lot of changes in behaviour.
Is it genetic?
The thinking is at the moment that there's a lot of research going on into the causes and what the reasons behind it might be. So the current thinking is that there's a genetic predisposition within the family. So within the family, there's about 100 or so genes that interact, not one single one that they can isolate. And so you have to have that likelihood there in the wider family. Then on top of that doesn't necessarily mean that you will go on to develop autism. There then needs to be some kind of trigger, some kind of environmental trigger that sets it off. And this is where the whole MMR debate has come in the past.
The whole what debate?
Sorry, MMR debate.
Tell me about MMR.
It's measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that children have at a particular age. And the age kind of coincides with the time at which people might start noticing the first symptoms of autism.
So they're building a relationship between the vaccine and autism?
Yeah, there's a whole debate around that.
But there's no definitive answer to
No,
that.
And it can be, the kind of trigger for it can be during pregnancy, it can be during delivery, it might be post, afterwards, when something particularly has happened to the child. I've had clients where there's been a head injury, a little boy who was thrown across the room at age 1, and that head injury resulted in him becoming autistic. I've known parents will say the child had chickenpox and a very high fever, was never the same afterwards. People who will say, swear blind, that the child has had the MMR vaccine, was fine beforehand, had a high fever, and then has been autistic afterwards. So at some point there needs to be something to trigger the autism off. And you might find in the wider family, if you go back a generation or so, that there will have been people with ADHD or with dyslexia or dyspraxia, or an auntie or an uncle who never really was very sociable and never spoke to anybody, but nobody recognised that they were probably on the autistic spectrum.
It seems now that it's, well, since was it Forrest Gump, the movie
Forrest Gump, yeah.
Yeah, the movie Forrest Gump.
And Rain Man. There's quite a few movies, Snow Cake, about people. And
it seems like since then there's been recognition or awareness of autism. How old is it a disease or illness? How do you refer to it?
We refer to it as a developmental disorder or a developmental condition, because it's not a disease or an illness implies that you can have a treatment or a tablet and you'll get better. Sadly, there's no cure for autism. If you have it for life.
Okay. So how is it that now there's so much talk about it and there's so much awareness being built around it? Is it becoming more prevalent? Is it developing more, or is it just being recognized more?
It's a good question. You've got the two sides to it there, and again, it's not been shown which it is. It could be that we're just becoming much more skilled, if you like, at recognising and at picking it up and seeing that that is what's happening very early on, as you were saying before. It could equally be that there is an increase in it. There's, again, studies going on at the moment trying to kind of tease out, is it that there are more people with autism, or is it that we're just picking it up? And you'll probably find it's a bit of both in together.
And so over time you've developed a set of signs and symptoms to determine what autism, whether someone is autistic or not.
Yeah, I mean, we have a set of signs or symptoms, if you like, that we work to at the moment that seem to broadly fit the whole spectrum. And people talk about a spectrum because, as you were saying, it's every child is different, every person, every adult on the spectrum is different, just as you and I might be different. Two people with autism would be very different. But there's kind of a pool of symptoms you would be looking for and seeing that people have enough of those, several of those, in order to meet the criteria for a diagnosis.
And what are those, and how is the criteria realized?
Okay, I knew you were going to ask that. So they talk about, the way it's thought about at the moment is a triad of impairments. So
say that again?
A triad of impairments.
A triad of impairments.
3 different areas you're looking for. So one would be in social communication. So you talked a bit about whether people have language and how people use language, how you and I would sit and use language here to communicate with each other, and we would do that, most children would do that without even thinking. It comes naturally. For children on the spectrum, as you were saying earlier, it may not come naturally at all. From very, very small, as babies and toddlers, they might be showing that they're struggling, or that they might not even be interested in language. They might show no interest in verbal speech from very early age.
So they won't talk at all?
Some might not talk at all. Some might not talk until they're, I have one client who didn't speak till he was 9 and then suddenly spoke like a professor. Absolutely incredible language. So you might have some people who don't speak from choice, but they're very able to speak and don't wish to. Other people may never develop language, may never speak at all, or might only have 1 or 2 words. So there's something around people having difficulties with language. The second part of the triad, of the triangle, is social interaction. So most children, as they grow up, will pick up most of the social rules, the ways to behave, the ways to do things. And we don't generally tell children, you know, you mustn't do this, or it's not nice to say that. They will watch the peers around them, they'll watch their parents, they'll pick up how to interact with other people. Children on the spectrum tend not to get that, and they tend not to pick up the social rules and how one is expected to behave, how one relates to another person. So you're looking as well for whether that child is the one who stands alone in the corner of the playground, who doesn't get how to interact with other children, with other people, whether that adult is somebody who says, but I always wanted friends, but I never knew how to do it, and every time I tried to do it, I got it wrong. So there's something around people not innately getting how to interact with other people. And then the third part of the triangle, clinically we talk about imagination, so deficits in imagination, but what that translates into is in small children you'd be looking, do they play with things? Can they pick up a car and move it along and pretend it's going somewhere? Can they pick up a banana and pretend it's a telephone and talk on it? Children and people, adults on the spectrum, tend to be very concrete and very literal. So if you gave them a banana, they would probably think, but it's a banana, and give it back, and not be able to pretend that it's something else. In adults, that lack of imagination tends to translate in not understanding the consequences of something, because if you do something, you need to use your imagination to forward think and think, well, I imagine if I did this, it would probably end up like that. So often we have issues with people doing things very spur of the moment with absolutely no understanding of the consequence of that. And if that's a law that they're breaking and no consequence of the law they're breaking, people can end up in very serious trouble. We have probably quite a high, we reckon, undetected population in the prisons who are on the autistic spectrum, who've broken the social rules, done things possibly without comprehending. So you'd be looking for that rigid, inflexible, concrete way of thinking as well. Okay.
So 3 basic things: speech development, sociable behavior, and imagination.
And a fourth, which is kind of goes along with it, is most people on the spectrum will have some kind of repetitive and ritualized behaviors as well. So you might be looking for, in the more severe end of the spectrum, children who sit and rock, or who like to look at the light through their fingers, or I sing a lad today who plays with his fingers all the time, who might have repetitive speech, that they'll be saying the same thing to you and again and keep repeating the same thing. So you're also looking for some evidence, if you like, of behaviour of that type.
Autistic people violent?
Some are. It can be. Not everybody.
How does that manifest? How does it develop?
My understanding of it, my view of it, is that usually training staff, training people, I tend to say to them, if you think of nothing else, try and think of it as an anxiety disorder, because I've yet to meet anyone in, whatever it is, 13 years of working with people who isn't highly anxious. And I would say that people who become violent or who become aggressive, usually it's because they're completely outside their comfort zone, they're incredibly anxious, and they can't find any other way of dealing with that kind of very overwhelming emotion at the time. So you might get, Sue was talking a bit about sensory overload, people tend to get emotional overload as well. Emotion is another whole area that's very difficult for people to explain and to understand what's happening to them. And if you think about it, if you can't even say, I feel angry, or I feel annoyed, or I feel upset, or something, you have no way of communicating that. The only way you can show it is through behaviour. So quite often people will go into what they talk about meltdown and have an autistic meltdown and just lose it altogether. Might get violent, might get very aggressive.
How does one respond to that, and how do you train persons to respond to that?
Perhaps you can share the experience that she had in dealing with some of the persons that she's interacted with.
Sometimes you literally have to find the trigger. Like there's a little one that I work with who is on the spectrum. He has limited speech, and the other day I heard him crying. So I was wondering, okay, well, he's been crying for about 2 hours. Let me go check and see what's wrong. So I went and I asked the caregiver as well, what's going on? What was happening? First, I approached him and he just ran from me, the opposite direction. I followed him and I tried to figure out what was going on, because he can't tell me what's going on. The only way for him to communicate is through the crying. And then I realized he was biting himself. And then I went towards him and he started to scratch me, because now I'm in his face. He's already frustrated and he wants me to just leave him alone, but he doesn't know how to say, well, leave me alone. So then I inquired with the caregivers, well, what's wrong? What's going on? He had a hanger, a wire hanger. So I was like, he had a hanger and they took it from him because they were afraid that he would poke his eye out. So I'm like, okay. So I went to him, I said, are you mad? I said, if you're mad, then say, I am mad. He said, mad. I said, okay, that's a start. I said, do you want your hanger? And he stopped crying for a minute. He looked at me. I said, if you want your hanger, just say, I want my hanger. He said, one hanger, please. So I said, he wants a hanger. Can you please get me a plastic hanger so I can give him the hanger? And I gave him the hanger. And that was it. Yeah. He was good, he was calm. He wanted the hanger, but they just couldn't, the caretakers in the environment just could not figure out what it was, what triggered the crying. So I guess you have to know the individual, and you have to know what they like, what they dislike, and that way it's a little easier to try and figure out, okay, what the trigger is, what's happening, what was going on.
That would require close attention.
Yes.
Yes, so you have to pay a lot of
attention to the individual you're working with.
Okay, so he was diagnosed as being autistic already. You know he was autistic. Is it known that he was autistic, or is that something that has just been determined, or you're still not sure?
I think we're still not 100% sure, but I think from one of the psychologists or the educational psychologist that's been working with him, they said he's suspected of having autism, and he shows the signs and the symptoms.
Okay. You talk about a spectrum, implying that there's wide-ranging behavior. So describe the spectrum and the wide-ranging behaviors.
Well, it can go, we talk about a spectrum because it covers people across all levels of ability. So you can have people from what they call classic Kanner's autism, the less able end of it, which would be usually the guys with a learning disability as well, who, like you've been describing, not able to communicate, not with much speech. Often down that end of the spectrum, people tend to have quite challenging behaviour for all those reasons. And then right at the high functioning end, autism is no respecter of class, of status, of cognitive ability. Right at the high functioning end, you can have people who are very, very bright, very capable, very able, and they might be called, the way it's worded at the moment, they might be called Asperger's syndrome, which is
they might be called
Asperger's.
Yeah. Asperger's.
Named after Hans Asperger, who was a psychiatrist in Vienna in the 1940s at the same time as Kanner was working as well, and they both recognised two different groups of people, and they gave the syndromes two slightly different names, and Asperger's syndrome is named after Hans Asperger because they tend to be the high function, the people who are very able, the people who could be working in universities as lecturers, or people who are very able, if they can find a way to use their particular skills. These guys are the ones who might be holding down jobs, who might be perhaps in relationships, married, that kind of thing, but struggling still on the social side. So the people at the more able end, I quite often see who are coming for a diagnosis much later in life. As you said earlier, there's an awful lot more media attention and input these days around autism. People in general, in the public, are much more aware. So it's not unusual for people in their 40s, 50s, one gentleman is 65, I saw a while ago, to work out for themselves that might be what the issue is, and recognise that actually this is why they've had a lifetime of struggling with relationships, a lifetime of struggling with jobs, with friendships. And actually it isn't that there's anything seriously wrong with them in the terms they might have thought. It's because they have this condition.
Now you see in movies and you hear about autistic persons that are very bright, right? I want to talk a little bit about that. I just got a flashing red sign that says BREAK.
Oh.
So we're going to take a break, and we're going to come right back, and we're going to come back, we're going to open up the phone line, so the phone numbers will pop up on the screen. You can call or you can text and ask any questions you like about autism. Keep it locked right here at Spotlight. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors.
Spotlight is brought to you by the National Bank of the Virgin Islands, Tortola Concrete Limited, Gilbert's Painting Contractors, and CCT Global Communications.